session again is by Nancy, and she will be talking to us today about fact checking and anti-racist resources. Hi, Nancy. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well.
Good. So without further ado, I can turn it over to you. I know we're really looking forward to your presentation.
I hope so. Okay, I'll pull up my slides here.
Okay.
And let's get back to the beginning of it. Okay, are we all ready to go?
We are.
All right. Well, welcome. My name's Nancy Chiara. I'm the metadata librarian for JCPS, and I'm going to spend the next 25 minutes or so sharing some ideas and some resources about information and how we can judge its truthfulness. And I want to touch just very briefly on some anti-racist resources as well. So first, we should talk about why this topic deserves our attention. So there are many reasons why the topic of information literacy is so important, especially in our society where we are just absolutely bombarded with technology and informational outlets. In particular, our district's policies and guiding principles include skills such as identifying, evaluating, analyzing, and summarizing reliable information, and also assessing the credibility and accuracy of those sources. We can mitigate this somewhat by steering students to our online databases that have sources that have been vetted and evaluated. But that doesn't address the need for students and adults to be able to evaluate what they encounter in social media and televised information sources. The job of educating students about information literacy has typically been the job of the school librarian, and they address these issues regularly. But just as students face information sources pretty much everywhere, they need to have these skills and concepts reinforced by their classroom teachers. Educators need to be well-versed in evaluating information themselves so they can better guide their students. So what's up with the news? I think we've all seen that people talk about this one goes left, this one goes right. My links kind of disappeared in here.
Hi, Nancy, and I'm sharing your screen for you as well.
Oh, okay. Well, here's I think sometimes we think fake news is something that's like kind of current or a new phenomena, but here, the Library of Congress came across this photo over here of Ulysses S. Grant sitting on his horse, looking very soldierly. It was credited of 1902, and actually the person that came up with it or developed it was actually the nephew of Matthew Brady, the well-known photographer of the Civil War. But as you can see, it's actually a composite of these three pictures. They didn't have a lot of pictures of Grant while he was in the midst of fighting. He just didn't want to take the time for pictures, and it just was not exactly, cameras were hard to come by, and there weren't that many photographers. But after the war, people wanted to have some kind of a record, so if you look really closely, it's his head on this horse in this background. So I just want to kind of share that to show that this isn't something that, and there's examples of manipulation of data and news that go far back beyond even before the Civil War. So when we look at our current situation, I think this chart right here kind of helps to kind of define where everybody is. This group, they have developed a chart where they measure how reliable a news source is or a news story, and which way does it slant. So over here on this key over here, you can see this green box up in the top is considered the most reliable news sources. And by that, they've looked at the instances of inaccuracy and just complete things that completely weren't right or true. So the lower on the chart it goes are where you're going to find the more inaccurate news stories or the most misinformation. And then depending on if it slants left or right, you can tell that by where it is on the chart. And you can zoom in closer and kind of look for your news sources, but we also might be thinking, okay, who's doing the chart? How are they coming up with this? So this chart was maintained by a group of media experts, and the group intentionally includes individuals that have personal views that cover the range from left and right. So the articles are all reviewed by three people in order to get as objective as possible of a rating. So lastly, I would suggest that relying on one news source, regardless of how credible it is not a great idea. It's better to review information from a variety of sources, although I would aim for the sources that are in the green box. And while it might be interesting to have varying opinions, because these are kind of slant on both sides, it's important to know that the sources on which they're basing their opinions is accurate information. So you can always go back and visit this chart and kind of play around with it and see where your news outlets kind of tend to fall. So next. So more information on the Wild West of info and how information gets twisted and manipulated in the news. And I just brought this up because this book, if you're interested, this book does a really, really good job, much better than I can do in a 15-minute, or 20-minute talk. It was published in 2018, so it's relatively recent. And the FPL, the LFPL has some copies if you're interested in getting it. He does a really good job too. Mr. Barclay does a good job of staying apolitical. His examples and explanations he tends to take from history, although you can see connections in our current news today based on what he's coming up with. His interview here is really interesting. It talks about how social media impacts misinformation. And there's a transcript there. Again, I'm not going to take the time to look at it. You can kind of go back and revisit it. The SCRAP test I am going to show you guys. The CRAP test has been around for a long time, and that's a lot of JCPS librarians use it as a way to help students remember what they should be looking at. So it was usually just this bottom part here, and then most recently the S has been added because we do know that understanding what your personal biases are and your personal slant can impact how you determine some of these. It can kind of determine how you look at the purpose or the relevance. So it's important to kind of add that particular component into any evaluation that you're doing. And then this one right here, ways to spot misinformation. This is from a group, this Storyful. This company, actually, that's their job. They go out and fact check. And they've shown a way, well, let me scroll down here. It's kind of stuck. Anyway, if you could, there it goes. It follows the kind of the why, what, when, where, and who kind of method of how to evaluate information as you're getting it. And this site in particular, part of it is blocked because you have to pay for it, but the free section is really, really interesting where they go through, especially how they decide or how they evaluate images. They show how they check images for being retouched and adjusted on dates and different clues they can use to see if an image has been misplaced, used in the wrong story, or used in a manner in which that doesn't represent the story that it actually was supposed to represent. So here's you probably learned about this in school. I did, even back in the 70s. Logical fallacies, ways that information can get a little twisted around or presented in a way that kind of hides the facts. So this link up here will take you to a really large dictionary of just a plethora of different fallacies. But some of the ones I think we see more commonly, this ad hominem, that's where we're going to attack the person. It doesn't really have anything to do with any kind of an issue. It's just basically name calling. Bandwagoning is just joining the fad. I'm going to join on because everybody else is doing it and everybody else I know is following this, so it must be true. Confirmation bias, we see that a lot, like with our news that kind of has slants now, one way or the other. People tend to kind of lean towards those kind of outlets that already agree with what they think. So rather than looking at any kind of a balanced, objective news, people will oftentimes kind of just gravitate towards that news that is reflective of what they already think. Straw man, that takes somebody's argument and then distorts it and then argues about the distortion. Red herrings, that's where they kind of just throw something out, just kind of detract or mislead somebody away from the relevant question. The correlation with causation, sometimes this one, we see this a lot, where they'll take two unrelated events, but somehow draw a conclusion between these two. And it can be really, can appear really plausible unless you look really closely at, does either these two things really have a whole lot to do with it? Or could a different variable have impacted why something occurred? We already looked at some deceptive images, and those get used a lot. Cherry picking and emphasizing outliers, those are both ways of manipulating data. In this case, you're only presenting the facts that actually back up what you want to show, and emphasizing outliers is again where, and sometimes this can enter in when we have personal stories, because we may have a lot of data that supports one viewpoint, but then there's always going to be those where that don't fit in that large group. But does that necessarily mean that those conclusions based on that large data is inaccurate? I mean, outliers are, they're pretty much going to be there. And I'm not saying we should ignore outliers, but I'm not sure we should base all of our conclusions solely on the small data rather than on the larger data. Oops, I'm just clicking away here. And now I wanted to show you guys some resources that are kind of closer to home. So we're going to start with, of course, I'm a librarian, so of course we're going to have to look at a LibGuide. I mean, I do this because a lot of our LibGuides have one-stop shopping where you can find all sorts of information on these fact-checking. So activities you can bring to your students. And they have Atherton, Heather Waters, the librarian there, has developed this Fight the Fake page. And we probably have all heard of Snopes. This one takes all sorts of different stories and reviews them. Sometimes they will do it even before the conclusion has been determined, and they'll continue to update it. So here's one about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I think they were talking about initially, this one had something, here it is. Where'd it go? They changed their page from like a half an hour ago. They had a story in here before that talked about something that she had published back in the 70s, and it kept cropping up because they were only using bits and pieces of it. So it has different evaluations from truthful to almost true to mostly true, and kind of points out what's true and what's not. And I think it's still thinking to load, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to another one. Factcheck.org is mostly political, but it does cover other things. You can see on the right-hand side, there's a section here on coronavirus coverage and science stuff and Facebook initiatives. And they're pretty good about being apolitical as well. As far as not picking a side. Then here they'll go through and they'll comment on some of the fact-checking they've done on Biden and inaccurate things that he may have said, and they go right on here and start talking about Trump and some of the inaccuracies that he said. And they're pretty good about simply looking for misinformation, not necessarily focusing on anything in particular that they want to have an agenda. Procon.org is not so much a fact-checking site. It's more of a place where you can get information on both sides of the story. So if you want to know the pros and cons of what's going on with, I'm just clicking the first one here, with the election, it's going to give you the issues and who says what about those particular issues. And it really does present the information much more like in a debate format. Or if we want to talk about gun control, it's going to show what people say for and what they say against. And it gives, and like I said, this is sort of if you've done the debates, this is pretty much how those are outlined. It kind of would be helpful in a classroom because it's an example of how you can argue productively. And I use the term argue more in a legal framing rather than in the shouting and hostile way. But it kind of shows how students can disagree about something and how they should disagree and how they can present their side and back it up with some information and some facts. Let's see. PolitiFact is one of my favorites. They'll pull up all sorts of stories, and then they have this little truth-o-meter over here. So they will show, and you can kind of get this just as a quick peek, that this statement was false. When they really find something, they have a pants on fire if it's really like completely not true. So, and then they have a mostly false. And if you actually clicked on here and read through the articles, it would point out what was true and what wasn't. So this is kind of a helpful way of looking at information, and I kind of like the tongue-in-cheek evaluations with the little pants on fire icon. The last one I'll take a peek at real quick is this all sides. This one's really helpful because it puts the left, the center, and the right on a specific topic. So if you're trying to show your students how to look and compare, this is a pretty user-friendly site where it already kind of divvies it up for you and kind of makes those kind of descriptors so it's easier to figure out which is which. I thought it was interesting. If you go through and look at these sources, these actually line up very well with where they were placed on that first chart that I showed you. So you'd find often the BBC tended to be right down kind of right down in the middle. And so it's kind of interesting to see that these are actually kind of following the same trend that that chart that showed where they leaned. It kind of just verifies that chart. Okay, let's go back here. So this facetious, this is actually a little game, and it's kind of entertaining, and it might be a good way for, I mean, you can test yourself, but you can also use it at school. It's got different levels, and what it does, it just pulls up different stories, and you have to decide whether that story is true or not, and then it tells you whether, and they find some pretty off-the-wall stuff. So it gives you this story to look at, and so it talked about this guy who supposedly went back to his burning car to light a cigarette, and you want to say, is this true or not? That sounds pretty far-fetched to me. You click here. And up, it's not fake, it's a news story. And so then they tell you where they got it from, and you can continue. So this kind of just is a nice way to kind of gauge where you might think stories fall, and to find out how good you are at actually recognizing them. Fight the Fake is another, this is LSU. They have offered some different methods for evaluating information. So you can use the ACT UP method, or you can use the I'm vain method. These are all just little acronyms to make you remember what you should be looking for when you're trying to evaluate information. And there's a lot of good stuff on this website. You can kind of go back through and look through there. And then the last one, this is developed by the University of Southern California at, I think, Santa Barbara. And they have a whole, this whole webpage is designed to just talk about like fake news and the history of it. And it really goes back to like, back into the 1800s when newspapers were kind of designed just to sell. I mean, I'm not sure a whole lot's changed, where they would show different pictures that were misrepresenting. I mean, it's just kind of an interesting place to kind of go back through and to kind of remember that what we're experiencing today is, I mean, yellow journalism has been around for a long time. So all we have now is we just have more access, which just puts more onto the consumer to make sure that they're evaluating and they're not just sort of, is that what's, kind of what's watching the news then news without kind of thinking about it. So I think, what can we do now after we've kind of looked through this really hurriedly? So what you can do is you can audit your information seeking practices. You can, are you getting information from one source or sources that reflect only one point of view? Maybe you should add some other sources to your list and try to get a bigger picture. This will let you think critically about how you really think and also provide a clearer rationale to support your views. It would also be a really good idea to reflect on your personal biases. If you can identify your tendencies, you can be more objective in your thought process, and also add diverse voices to your information sources. This will add dimension and a perspective and give you a broader context of what is in the news. And one important step is to model and teach these to your students. Our students are growing up in a world that bombards them with information, and we all know the quality of that information covers everything from outright lies and inadvertent misinformation, and hidden in there is accurate and mostly unbiased reporting of information. But I think it's only going to get worse, and we need to really start when they're young so that this becomes an ingrained skill. And we need to foster skepticism and questioning and guide students on how to actually find the answers. So that was the really, really quick talk on how to do fact checking. And of course, if you ever need any questions, just ask your school librarian or fire a question to LMS. So now I'm going to take just a bit of a shift and just briefly cover some anti-racist resources that are out there. And I also think that Rachel Klein from DEP, she might be in the chat if you have any questions. And I'm only skimming the surface here, and not because this topic isn't important, but because there are people that are better able to cover this topic. These are just a few resources that I think you could kind of start off with. So first, we're going to look at what JCPS has to offer. This Envision Equity, it's a monthly publication that comes out from our Diversity, Equity, and Poverty Division, and it's taking a really long time to load. You probably get a notification, and it's forwarded every month by your school librarian, but just in case, you can go to their website page, and hopefully it would load faster than this.
Nancy.
And there's a lot of, great, I can't access my own GCPS page.
So we are experiencing some internet outage to our data center, so some JCPS websites we cannot get to, unfortunately, right now, but that is probably what is happening with that website. And
Okay.
just FYI, I'm driving in the background for you. I've been able to keep up with you and clicking on those sites. But if you want me to continue to do that, I can. Or you
Sure.
can. Okay, sounds good.
That'd be great. Because I know I'm talking really, really fast.
No,
But I was trying to cram
I'm
a bunch of stuff in a really short amount of time.
yeah, we're
So
good.
yeah, when you get a chance, if you haven't seen this, I mean, I know that when you get bombarded by those building all emails, sometimes they kind of get lost in the shuffle. But you can just go to the website and click on these. There's a lot of good resources in there. Some great lesson plans, great lesson ideas. So and there's a bazillion book lists that have been flying around out there. And I'm only going to share a couple. This one right here was from School Library Journal. And it's from the Teen Librarian Toolbox, and you'll be able to access this and kind of just jot through. There's not a whole lot on here because I'm not sure having a reading list that's got like thousands of books on it's all that helpful. But it's got a little bit for little guys. It's got some stuff for children. It's got some stuff for adults, and this might be a good place to start if you're looking for some things that might be helpful to read. And then the other book list that I've included here is from Dr. Kindy. So, and this was actually, I actually took this it was from an article on Oprah magazine. And again, these are the recommendations that he has for books that would be helpful. And Dr. Kindy is a professor at Boston University, and he's spending the 2020-2021 school year as a Francis Cashin Fellow at Radcliffe Institute and the Advanced Study at Harvard. In his book, Stamped in the Beginning, that was published in 2 versions. The original one was in 2016. It was for adults. And then a remix was published this year in collaboration with Jason Reynolds for young adults. And I personally found the young adult version very, very engaging. So here's some other stuff that he suggests that you might want to read. Let's see. I kind of picked this because some of these aren't the ones that you're going to find on the typical, anti-racist book list. So I wanted to show some stuff that you might not come across. Oh, and a lot of these you can get from the public library too, if you're looking for something to get from there. So there we have that. And now let's see what's going on in JCPS, Central High School. Of course, I'm going to their LibGuide. She has the page, Adrienne Lane, the librarian there, has she's got a book challenge, Read Woke challenge. So she's got a list of some great titles for kids to read, and then if they read so many books and complete by a certain date. But actually, I think the adults and our educators, if you haven't been reading this stuff, here's a great place to find some young adult books to read. And like I said, and a lot of the school LibGuides have information like this on there. And then 2 more places that I wanted to share is the Smithsonian. The National Museum of African American History and Culture. They have a really, really good website, as you would expect, that covers all sorts of. You could, even though it doesn't seem all that long, there's so many internal links, and it's just full of information and other things to read and links to other people's ideas and some videos. And there's Dr. Kindy. So this would definitely be a good place that you could use, and you could also take your students there. It's got some activities in here embedded, some questions. There's just so much stuff in here that, it would take, you could spend an hour just kind of going through and describing all these things. So that would be a really, really good resource to use just for yourself and also for your students. And then lastly, we have this website that, especially the part on the fundamentals and the plan stage, there's a lot of just background information here with links and definitions and just different data. And also the plan section in particular. These had, if we wanted to look at just one topic, it has just lists and lists and lists of resources that are surrounded around a certain topic. So this would be really, really a good place for you to go to look for information if you have a certain topic you want to use in class, or if you're just interested in it personally. So that, and then these copies down here, these are just more, I figured I probably should have some books that were related to education, although CAST isn't specifically an education book. These others are, and they probably would be a good place, if you haven't read them, to go ahead and dip your toe in there and read these books. So I don't know if there's any questions out there.
Right now, Russ Hockenberry, he said great resources, and Chris Edmund brought deeper learning, and there are quite a few high school librarians in the chat. Janet, of course, she said great job, and Heather Waters and Ashley Freeman. Just more and more. Holly, Sarah, more. Adrian was in the chat as well. So a lot of people are in the chat to tune in.
Great. Well, and that pretty much wraps it up for me. And again, if anybody does have any questions, feel free to contact your school librarian or the crew at LMS, and we'll be happy to help you out.
Yeah, and Rusty did have a question, but you can go to the chat to look that up. But his question was, can we get these resources to some of the folks in the Big Brother All-Stars house? So, because we do know that these resources should be shared far and wide for everyone.
If you access my presentation, all of these are live links, so you should be able to access everything that's in here to come. I knew I wouldn't be able to cover all these in very much in depth. So if you just want access, if you can put the Google presentation link in there, then they'll have links to everything that I showed.
Okay, yeah.
And they're all open and all free, so.
Yes. Yeah, and Russ said, yep. And yes, I do know that, Russ. But on a serious note, that these are great resources to share with everyone as well, regardless if they are with JCPS or outside of JCPS.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing. And I'm going to type in the chat one last time about the direct link to your presentation.
Okay.
Because, again, just amazing resources for everyone to share. All right. Yep, and I am posting it right now. Yep, there's quite a few people already in your presentation to share. All right.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.
All right, take it easy.
Uh-huh.